Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India. Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, let's have a look at the development of air transportation in India over the years. We start with the pre-independence days of our country, the pre-independence era. Until about 1910, the civil aviation sector in India remained absolutely dormant. These were very early days anyways, because in 1903 is when the first successful flight by Wright brothers took place. So 7 years from then is a very short time for any air transportation system to be developed in India. In 1920, the Indian Air Board was formed. This was a statutory body of the government of India at that time. This particular body came up because of a memorandum focusing on preventing foreign dominance in India's air transportation sector. So, in 1926 a memorandum was written, because till that time all the air transport in the country was being dominated by foreign air carriers, and that is simply because the government at that time lacked the resources to run its own airline. So, it was depending on foreign air carriers. In 1929, the Indian Air State Service was started. It was an agreement that involved flights which were chartered by the then Indian government. Now, a chartered flight essentially means a flight which is operated for a particular group of customers or flyers. In this case, the customer was single, it was the government. So, they were chartering all the flights, and the technical and the operational control was retained by an airline called Imperial Airways over the then most popular route, the Karachi to New Delhi route. So, on this route the technical and operational control was retained by Imperial Airways, and the chartered flights were operated. Moving ahead, there was, as time passed, there was some development of indigenous domestic airlines in the private sector. The first scheduled airline in India was the Tata Airways, and this was they started operation on 15th October 1932, but notice that it was mainly used for transporting mail. So, it transported mail in the Karachi Bombay route via Ahmedabad and Madras, and it was successful, and it was a 10-year agreement. So, that is how the Indian aviation industry began with Tata Air Service or Tata Airlines. In 1933, another airline called as Indian National Airways, it carried passengers, mail and freight. This was in the eastern sector, Calcutta to Rangoon, and Calcutta to Dhaka routes. Both of these were quite successful, and in 1932 another entity called as the Delhi Flying Club, it was transporting mail and it did for about a year and a half. So, these were the three initial domestic airlines of India in the early 30s. Moving ahead, in 1938, the first class mail transport without any surcharge was introduced. The two airlines I spoke about, Tata Airlines and the Indian National Airways, they were offered a 15-year contract under this scheme to transport first class mail. Now, during World War II, the focus shifted elsewhere. The funds were diverted towards the war effort, and therefore, because of the World War II, the mail transport and passenger traffic, they were reduced. Okay. Till 1946, no licensing was required to operate flights in India, and post World War II, which ended in 1945 approximately, increase in the air transportation led to more regulations. So, there was a need felt to bring in some regulation, and the Air Transport Licensing Board was formed. This was established. Now, what was the role of Air Transport Licensing Board? It was to grant, to amend, to suspend or to revoke the licenses for operating flights, and these decisions were based on the need, on the traffic, and an assessment of the capability of the airline to meet the requirement for which they were bidding or they were requesting. Okay. So, that is how regulation started in this country just before independence. In the post independence era, we observed a lot of night air services. They were introduced just after independence by Government of India. The aim was to transport air mail at night to the major cities, and at that time the four major cities were Calcutta, Bombay, Madras and Delhi. Then Nagpur, being the geometric center of the country, also had an important role in the freight and mail transport. So, Delhi, Nagpur, Madras and Bombay, Nagpur, Calcutta routes also became very popular. The ranges of the aircraft were also quite small. So, a stop at Nagpur would be a very useful spot, and plus because of being the geometric center, it becomes easy to transport the cargo and the mail. This particular scheme was reformed in 1949, and it led to higher revenues for the air carriers. It also boosted the cargo traffic and improved the postal services because there were regular flights carrying the mail. Now, the government intervened, and because of that it allowed the air carriers to increase the fares and also the payload of the aircraft. So, they could go for larger aircraft, and it was realized right up front that this aero turbine fuel, or ATF as we call it, is going to be a very expensive part of the operating cost. So, partial rebate on customs duty for the import of aero turbine fuel for flying purposes was also given by the government. So, in April 1949, there was an all up mail scheme which boosted the airline revenue a lot. Let us now look at the international operations in the post independence era. Before we received independence in 1947, foreign airlines were serving all the international routes operating in and out of India. In 49, in post independence, an agreement with this private airline from the Tatas was made to establish Air India International. So, this is the first attempt to provide a national airline over international operations. Unfortunately, it was found that the private airlines which were operating at that time, they were not very profitable and they relied a lot on the government aid and new schemes for relief. So, Deccan Airways Limited was one airline, one such private airline. Himalaya Airlines was also in force, but they were not doing very well. Okay. So, in 1950 an Air Transport Inquiry Committee was formed to study the industry's airline industry state and to decide what to do to make it sustainable and profitable. And this led to the nationalization of the air transport sector in the country, and it was decided that there will be one national airline for domestic operations, that was called as Indian Airlines, and there would be one nationalized airline for operations in international routes, and that was called as Air India. So, for many years the only two airlines in the country were Indian Airlines and Air India. So, the Air Corporation Act 1953 nationalized the Indian aviation industry, and this particular nationalization continued till 1994. Under this nationalization scheme, it was decided that there will be only two airlines within the country, one named Indian Airlines for all domestic routes and the other named Air India for all the international routes. So, for many years, close to around 40 years, there were only two airlines in the country, and we will very soon see how in 1994 there was a partial deregulation of the Indian air transport industry and many other private airlines then came into being. So, let us look at the state of Indian Airlines over several years after nationalization. So, the data on the left hand side gives you the 5-year profit and loss numbers in millions of US dollar between 1960 to 1994. So, as you can see, the initial numbers are very small, just about $1 million, and also there are several years when there was a negative number, which means there was a loss, and this loss became very high in the early 90s. As you can notice, the number is minus $121 million. So, this caused a huge amount of distress in the industry, and the government had to take action. So, in 53 Indian Airlines was formed as a merger of 8 domestic airlines, and because there were 8 different domestic airlines, all their routes were absorbed in Indian Airlines. Those routes were very chaotic and the operational efficiencies were very, very low. So, there were many losses, and the factors that contribute to them are also quite a few. Some of the factors are overcapacity, poor fleet condition, lack of investment in the fleet renewal and competition from private carriers. These are some of the reasons because of which there was a deterioration and limited services, and finally slowly there was a loss of market share and profits. So, you can see that in 1990 to 1994 there was a huge loss for Indian Airlines. The situation was not very different for Air India. However, Air India, despite the issues, it continued to generally earn profit. So, despite international competition, Air India was profitable during 1960 to 1990, right, and the main reason for that is that there was a lot of captive market in the India to Gulf route because of the frequent travel of the migrant workers, and this is one particular route that has kept Air India very profitable. But there were reports of very poor capacity growth. The whole airline operated under lot of restrictions. There was a lack of management or managerial autonomy, and many of the studies have shown that both Indian Airlines and Air India performed poorly. There are several reasons. One can summarize them, that the main problem is that because they were nationalized, they were operated like any other public sector agency. So, the policy regime and regulations are to be blamed for the poor functioning of both the Indian Airlines and Air India. So, in 1994, the government announced a partial deregulation. Okay. There were two factors which affected this decision. One is the economic development. So, there was a need to deregulate because of the need for capital, because aerospace or air transportation is a very capital intensive industry. There were several capacity constraints, so it was decided that capacity should be improved by allowing more players to come in, and it was felt that if you liberalize this particular sector, even though partially, you will have good overall economic development. Okay. All of it led to an increase in the demand of air services, and the aims of this partial deregulation exercise of the Government of India was to attract private investment in this industry, because it was becoming too difficult and very expensive for the government to continue to keep funding the air transportation sector. Another aim was to enhance the air connectivity, because many operators would like to operate only on certain routes which were very profitable. So, there was a huge bloodbath and massive competition on those routes, and many other places which needed connectivity were untouched. And also the aim of this exercise was to encourage competition. Now, this is on one side. On the other side, there were lots and lots of other countries which were also deregulating their air transportation, starting in 1978 by the US, about which we have already seen the Airline Deregulation Act. So, the global trend began in 1970s with the US, and it was followed by countries like New Zealand, Australia, Canada and UK. They all adopted some kinds of deregulation of the aviation sector by 1980s. Okay. So, the features of the deregulation which were implemented by other countries were that they granted ease in entry and exit into this business. So, the barriers to entry and the barriers to exit were removed or made very, very less. The airlines had a full autonomy in selection of the routes that they would fly, what fares they would charge, and the subsidies which were given for transportation sector were slowly minimized and removed. These are the features of the international deregulation activities. Now, the economic development on one hand and the worldwide success of deregulation activities on the other hand, both of them forced India's hand, and India had to go for partial deregulation. But why do we call it a partial deregulation? So, let us just compare the features of the deregulation introduced in India in 1994 with that in the US, which was introduced in 1978. So, here is a comparison, a very broad top level comparison. The deregulation in the US can be considered to be total, because there was absolutely no restriction. In India it was partial, as I will elaborate very soon. There were many private airlines before deregulation in the US. In India, the problem was different. In India, the government owned airlines, Indian Airlines and Air India, they faced resource constraints, and that was the motivating and driving force in India to go for the partial deregulation. The motivation for deregulation in the US was research for industry efficiency, whereas in India the motivation was capacity growth due to resource limits. Okay. What were the key aims of the Indian deregulation exercise? First of all, there was a need felt to provide some essential air services to remote areas. Many areas in the country were unconnected or very, very sparsely connected, and there was a need felt to boost connectivity in those areas. The connectivity was aimed to provide economic growth in those regions which were lagging behind compared to the other regions, and also the resources were constrained for the development of the infrastructure. That was also another aim. So, let us look at now in 1994 how the partial deregulation of the Indian sector was announced by the submission of the route dispersal guidelines in 1994. So, in a short, these guidelines were aimed to categorize the routes in India to give better connectivity. So, what was done is that the entire air network in the country was categorized into 3 types of routes or 3 category of routes. Category 1 were the 12 trunk or major routes which were between major cities of the country, and they were profitable, they were very much preferred, and there was a lot of comparatively a lot of travel demand in these routes. So, that is the category 1 routes. Now, category 1 routes is the routes where all airlines would like to fly, but to ensure that we disperse the traffic and we encourage traffic in other areas, category 2 routes were classified as routes which connected the states in the northeastern region which had very poor connectivity, the connectivity to areas in Jammu and Kashmir for administrative and official reasons, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands again for administrative office reasons and for tourism, and the Lec05 Islands. So, any route from a point in the country to any of these routes and back would classify as a category 2 route, and then all other routes were called as category 3 routes. So, this is how the categorization was done. Let us have a look at what these routes are. So, the category 1 routes were the routes as shown in this particular figure. So, there were 6 routes emanating out of Mumbai, there were 3 routes emanating out of New Delhi, and there were 3 routes emanating out of Kolkata. Okay. And these 12 routes were the main routes on which every airline wanted to operate. So, category 2 routes were the routes that covered the 7 sisters in the northeast, then Jammu and Kashmir, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and the Lec05 Islands. So, these 4 pockets of the country which were at that time poorly connected by air, the routes which were emerging out of these or towards these or within these were called as the category 2 routes. Right. Now, there were some guidelines for operations which were given. So, there was no limit on how many seat miles can be operated by an airline in category 1 route. By seat mile, what I mean is number of seats multiplied by the distance to be travelled between those 2 points. So, there was no restriction. An airline could operate as many routes on category, as many flights, as much frequency on category 1 routes as they wanted, but there was a condition that 10% of the capacity deployed by an airline on category 1 routes, it had to be deployed on category 2 routes. Remember, those category 2 routes are the ones which are connecting the 4 unconnected regions, the Jammu Kashmir, the northeast, the Andaman Nicobar, and the Lec05. So, if an airline operates X amount of seat kilometers in Cat 1 routes, it had to operate minimum 0.1 times that on the Cat 2 routes. Now, there was no restriction that the same airline had to operate. They could tie up with other small airlines, and there could be smaller airlines which could operate these routes on behalf of the bigger airlines. And then on category 3 routes, which is the rest of the country, there was a requirement that half the capacity deployed on the Cat 1 routes had to be deployed to connect the other tier 2 and tier 3 cities within the country. So, with this, there was a choice given for the airlines to operate any amount of capacity on Cat 1 routes with the restriction of introducing minimum 10% and 50% respectively on Cat 2 and Cat 3 routes. This was the way in which the government ensured that connectivity over the entire country was increased. Now, these guidelines which appeared in 1994, they were revised in 2016, and these revisions were aimed to include more areas which had emerged as important areas, and also to rationalize some of the routes based on the experience of so many years. So, again there were routes of 3 categories. The category 1 routes, which were 12 routes earlier, have now been made as 20 trunk routes. So, another 8 routes were introduced. Category 2 was subdivided into 2 categories, category 2A, which contained routes within the northeastern region, Jammu Kashmir, Andaman Nicobar and Lakshadweep as before, but 3 more items were introduced: routes in Himachal Pradesh, routes in Uttarakhand, and one specific route which is Cochin to Agatti to Cochin. So, any flight that operates within northeastern region or within Jammu Kashmir, when you say within, you mean that a flight should start and end from these regions. That is called as category 2A routes, and category 2B routes were routes which were connecting these regions to the other places in the country. Okay. So, now category 2 has been cut into 2 parts. One is intra travel and the other is the travel with the connection from the remaining part of the country. And of course, category 3 routes remained all other routes apart from these. So, apart from creating this subdivision between category 2, the reason for this probably is that when the airlines were operating on Cat 2 routes, they were deploying most of their capacity connecting these far flung regions with other places. So, the travel between these regions was very, very poor. Okay. So, this is the revised picture. Now, instead of 6, there are now 7 routes from Mumbai, and Delhi there are 8 routes, and there are 2 routes from Chennai, and there are 3 routes from Bengaluru. So, if you add them up, you will get 20. So, the 12 trunk routes became 20 trunk routes by introduction of new routes and newer emerging major cities. And the category 2 routes earlier were these 4 regions, they still remained, but there were additions. As I said, Himachal Pradesh was added, Uttarakhand was added, and one specific route between the Agatti Islands and Kochi in Kerala, this one return route was also added in the category 2. Okay. So, this is how the route dispersal guidelines were then subsequently modified. Apart from defining the subdivisions, there were also some changes in the guidelines. Once again, there was no limit on how much traffic or how much capacity an airline deploys on category 1 routes, but in Cat 2 there was a requirement of 10% of the capacity on Cat 1 routes. But there was an interesting point that out of those 10%, a major fraction should be only on category 2A routes. Okay. So, 1% of the capacity deployed on Cat 1 routes should be deployed on Cat 2A routes, which if you remember are the interconnecting routes between these regions. So, while the overall capacity in Cat 2 was still 10%, but there was a additional requirement that 10% of that 10% or 1% of the Cat 1 should be deployed on Cat 2A routes, and rather than 50% as in the previous case, 35% of the capacity should be deployed on category 1 routes. So, a concession was given on category 3 routes. Earlier, half of your capacity on Cat 1 had to be deployed on Cat 3 routes, but now it was reduced to 35%. So, with these guidelines, the air network in the country has improved a lot. So, currently what do we have in the country is that Air India has been privatized and the Tatas have again become owners of the airline. Vayudoot was operating in the northeastern area for short haul operations and it was linking the inaccessible areas, but Vayudoot went into it was merged with the Indian Airlines, and Pawan Hans Limited still operates some helicopters. Two areas: one, they operate helicopters to give service to the petroleum production areas like Bombay High for example, and they also provide helicopter services in northeastern areas and other states. Okay. So, what is the current scenario in India? The current scenario is that the air transportation sector is booming. There has been 11% growth in the passenger traffic. The foreign tourist arrival rate is also increasing by about 16%. 3.6 million metric tons of total freight has been transported, and the domestic movements have also increased by about 14%. So, this is the current state. The industry currently is booming, associated systems within the country. So, what are these policy initiatives? There are many of them, but we will look only at a few of them. One initiative that has been talked about a lot is the UDAN scheme. The other one is the productivity linked incentive scheme for drone manufacturing. Then there is the Krishi UDAN scheme which has been launched by the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and there is also a national air sport policy. Although the air sport policy does not come directly under air transportation as such, but the aim is to improve and to encourage the ecosystem in the country. We will look at each of these 4 initiatives a little bit to understand how they have affected or how they are affecting the Indian air transport industry today. First, let us look at the regional connectivity scheme called as UDAN, which stands for Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik. That is the full form of UDAN. So, the idea is to provide air transport access to the common man of the country. Now, the information that you will see about this particular scheme has come from the report of the Comptroller and Auditor General or CAG, which has recently been published. Okay, it is report number 22 of CAG on the UDAN scheme. So, what is the background of UDAN scheme? It was launched in pursuance of the provisions of the National Civil Aviation Policy, which was released in 2016. Okay. Now, the main aim of UDAN scheme was to enhance regional air connectivity. Despite the category 1, 2, 3 routes dispersal guidelines and the push towards connectivity, it was not actually taking place. So, because it was felt that merely forcing an airline to fly will not necessarily result in the connectivity, because they would try out and then they would stop flying if they were not profitable. So, some fiscal support and development of the infrastructure both needed to be there to enhance their connectivity, and that was taken up under the UDAN scheme. The aim of UDAN scheme was also to promote affordability in regional air connectivity by a series of measures, okay, and we will now look at these measures. So, let us look at how it was implemented. So, first of all, there were many unserved or underserved airports or routes in the country. By unserved airport or route, we mean that there was no flight in those airports, and by underserved we mean that there were less than 7 flights in a week. There were quite a few of them. In fact, some estimates have shown that there were nearly 400 airstrips within the country which could be used for providing connectivity via air transportation using small aircraft, using the commuter and regional aircraft. Then it was also observed that unless certain tangible concessions are provided to different stakeholders, the stakeholders being the airlines and the airports and the operators, the airline operators, this is a financial assistance given to an airline based on the number of capacity that they provide on these regional routes. So, it is a direct financial support per passenger carried on these routes. And then there was a requirement to look at cost effective security solutions by the Bureau of Civil Aviation Security, that is responsible for providing security at the airports, and also the various agencies of the state government which play a very active role. So, this was the 4-point implementation agenda. The nodal agency for this particular scheme was the Airports Authority of India, which operates, maintains the majority of the airports in the country, and also which provides the air traffic and which also provides the air traffic services. The focus of UDAN scheme was to encourage the sustainability of operations of RCS in the long term. It was not meant to be a one shot injection giving some support. The idea was that we will give support and we will hope that because of that support the transportation system will develop and it will spur the demand, and that will automatically continue in a sustainable fashion. And also the connectivity that was established should not depend on VGF in perpetuity, because after some time there was a plan to discontinue the viability gap funding, otherwise it does not become sustainable in the long run. That was the main focus of the UDAN scheme. So, what were the measures that were implemented or suggested in the UDAN scheme? So, to reduce the operating cost on regional routes, direct financial support was given to airlines and airport operators, and these were through some concessions which were given both by the central government and the state government. What are these concessions? Now, this money for this VGF cannot come directly or only from the government. So, therefore, a regional air connectivity fund or RCF had to be set up. This was funded by a levy or a fee per departure on all domestic flights by airlines on the non-RCS routes. So, 1000 rupees per passenger carried on the non-RCS routes was deposited, was to be deposited. So, 1000 rupees per passenger on all domestic flights other than RCS routes were to be collected and deposited by airlines towards the regional air connectivity fund. So, if you actually look at any of the flight tickets if you look at the air ticket for any route which is non-RCS route, you will find there is 1000 rupee charge towards the creation of the regional air connectivity fund. So, this whole money was to be collected and used for providing the concessions or the. In addition, a budgetary support of 4,500 crores was released or approved by the Government of India. This was mainly for development of infrastructure. So, either development or revival of the existing infrastructure, airports, heliports, and also water aerodromes. So, this was a grant from the central government towards infrastructure development, and there was a demand driven mechanism identified for the RCS routes. Okay. So, later on the routes, the airports or the airstrips identified, they would be upgraded or revived based on the demand driven mechanism. So, UDAN was actually implemented in 5 phases, but between 2016 October to March 21 there were only 3 phases. So, in UDAN 1 there were 132 RCS routes, and these covered 45 underserved or unserved airports. In UDAN 2 there were 228 fixed wing routes and 83 heliport routes. These covered 30 new unserved or underserved airports and 31 heliports. And under UDAN 3 there was additional 305 fixed wing routes and 26 water aerodrome routes. So, these water aerodrome routes were initiated under UDAN 3 to give a boost for connectivity using seaplanes and amphibian aircraft. These initiatives served 23 under or unserved airports and 10 water aerodromes. Let us see what concessions were given to the airlines apart from the viability gap funding, which was a cash concession. From the central government point of view, the excise duty on the aeroturbine fuel was reduced to 2% for 3 years. As you know, the aeroturbine fuel expenses consist a huge chunk of the operating cost of an airline, and a reduction in the excise duty on this particular item would be a big financial support to the airline. Secondly, the GST rates which were charged on airfare for the flight tickets, they were lowered for the tickets on the RCS or UDAN routes. So, from central government side there were two initiatives, reduced excise duty and reduced GST on the flight tickets for operations on the RCS routes. From the state government, it was ensured that the value added tax on the aeroturbine fuel would be less than or equal to 1%, and this was for 10 years, not only for 3 years. Then lower rates were charged to supply electricity, water and other utilities for operation of aircraft on RCS routes. Then if there was a requirement to create a new airport, then free land without any encumbrances was to be provided by the state government for development of the airport. Then the fire and security services constitute a huge cost in the operation, and they are essential, but they are used very sparingly. So, therefore, there was a decision taken to that this service will be provided free of cost by the state government, and the airline will not have to bear the expenses towards this. Plus, air transportation will grow only if there is a connectivity to the airport. So, multimodal hinterland airport connectivity was to be provided by the state government by building connecting roads, metro, railway and other connected points, so that passengers can easily come to these new or revived airports. That was the responsibility of the state government. And finally, the VGF, the viability gap funding, also had to be shared. So, 1/5 of the viability gap funding would be borne by the state government, and this 1/5 became 1/10 for states in the northeastern regions and the union territories. So, the state governments had an equal and a very important role in the UDAN scheme to ensure that the regional connectivity works and can be sustained. Then there were also some concessions from the airport operators, primarily it is the Airports Authority of India. So, the route navigation and facilitation charges which are charged by Airport Authority of India or any other service provider for providing navigation on the overflying routes, the charges were reduced by 7.5% for flights on the RCS. Then there are some terminal navigation landing charges for providing the air traffic control services and search and rescue services. These charges were waived for RCS routes by Airport Authority of India. Then there were exemption on the landing and parking charges, and many of these RCS aircraft were allowed self ground handling rather than depending on the infrastructure support from the airport and the charges that are to be paid for that. They were able to manage on their own. So, all these concessions helped in reducing the operating cost of the airlines operating on the UDAN flights. Okay. And the CAG report which I mentioned to you did have some observations regarding the scheme. See, the government can bring in a scheme, but its actual results or what actually happened is a function of the environment in the country and how people and the market actually responds. Now, air transportation is not a very straightforward kind of a system where you pump in some money and the results will come immediately, because there are many factors that play a major role. So, here are some observations from by the CAG on what happened in the UDAN scheme in 3 years time. So, CAG has mentioned that this is a good initiative for increasing air connectivity, because it will allow faster, safer and affordable option for travel to common people, and under this scheme for the first time some people were able to travel, and also because of that there is a multiplier effect on the economy. Okay. UDAN scheme has a potential to contribute towards many things, towards the economic development of the region, towards promoting the tourism at a particular region, towards optimization of natural resources, and important point is preparedness during emergencies for the unserved areas, because when there is a requirement during an emergency, at that time you cannot say that now we will set up the infrastructure. If the infrastructure is not there, it will not be possible to address an emergency. So, by providing infrastructure and by maintaining it in operating condition, you are also ready for any contingencies in the future. Okay. So, all of this led to a positive response from the passengers on the RCS route. It was observed that when the scheme was launched in 2017-18, there were 2.63 lakh domestic passengers on these RCS routes, and that number became almost 10 times more by the year 2022-23 to 24.97 lakhs. So, there was a huge push in the number of passengers, but the reality of on the ground is a bit different. CAG also observes about the implementation. So, the observation is that almost half of the routes which were actually awarded after the bidding by the airline, because in UDAN scheme the airlines were supposed to bid for a particular route, and then there was a counter bidding by some other airlines, there was a reconciliation, and finally a route was awarded to a particular airline. Unfortunately, 48% of the routes which were actually awarded, 371 out of 774, they could not commence the operation. Now, of the 371 routes which actually commenced operation, 30% of them only were able to complete or run for 3 years. Many of them, 70% of them had to be abandoned within 3 years. So, they were started, but they were abandoned because they were not found to be sustainable. Okay. And also, if you remember, the long term aim of this scheme was that by providing this particular boost, the system will automatically pick up, the demand will pick up, and it will then remain in a sustained manner beyond 3 years. That did not happen because only 48% of the routes that actually flew for 3 years were able to fly beyond 3 years. So, in all, if you multiply 48% with 30% with 48%, you will get only 7%. So, in all, only 7% of the routes which were actually awarded in the beginning could sustain beyond 3 years. 93% of the routes were not found sustainable. However, this did lead to a boost. Also, there were some objections raised and there were some recommendations made which will help in a better implementation of the UDAN scheme. So, this just points out to one thing, that the government on its own can come up with new initiatives and new schemes, but the situation on the ground can be quite different, and it is a total, the situation on the ground can be quite different. Sorry, we will record this again. Basically, the reality, the results of a particular scheme actually will only depend upon the ground realities, and with all the viability gap funding, with all the support, etc., even though the number of passengers have increased almost 10 times, sustainability of this particular scheme was not found really very good, and therefore, the result is that very few of the routes which were initiated actually have managed to go beyond 3 years. Moving on to another scheme, the PLI scheme for drone manufacturing, and the source for this information has come from the document from the Press Information Bureau. So, the productivity linked incentive scheme was notified by Government of India on 30th September 2021. The aim of this scheme was to basically push for the indigenous development of the drone industry, and the scheme is meant for drone manufacturers and companies that deal with various aspects of drones. It not only includes companies that fabricate drones, it also includes the developers of drone related software. So, the complete ecosystem of the drone technology is covered under the PLI scheme. What are the objectives of this particular scheme? The main objective of the drone PLI scheme is to incentivize manufacturing of drones and components in India, because this is a huge emerging market and we do not want to be left behind. We would like the drones to be self-sustaining and globally competitive. We would like to create a growth-oriented regulatory framework for drones, and the long-term aim is to make India the global drone hub by 2030. Only time will tell how much of this particular target could be achieved, but at least a scheme has been launched to attempt to move in that direction. Let us look at this scheme in some numbers. Okay. So, the budgetary outlay for this particular scheme from the Government of India is 120 crores for the 3-year period starting 2022 to 2025. Note that this is more than 2 times the combined turnover of all drone companies in the year preceding to when the scheme was launched. Okay. So, in 2021 the combined turnover of all drone companies was around 60 crores, and here they have given 2 times that, 120 crores. So, what are the incentives given? So, the incentives have been given for drone manufacturers and companies. So basically 20% of the value added during the next 3 years, less than that would be considered, and it will be definitely more than 40% of the net sales. Okay. So, to ensure that the benefits are not taken by only few entities, there is a restriction that 25% of the scheme budget can be allotted to only one entity. So, for one entity the limit is 25% of the scheme budget, okay. That means 30 crores, so that more and more companies are benefited. And the entry requirements for this scheme is kept very low. For the MSMEs, you just have to have 2 crore revenue and 0.5 crore profit, and for the non-MSMEs 4 crore turnover and 1 crore profit. That is all the requirement to benefit from this particular scheme. Now, what are the items covered under this scheme? As I mentioned, it is not just drone manufacturing, but the complete ecosystem. So, airframe and components is one major items, but it also covers propulsion system, that is the engines and the electrical engines. It covers power systems, batteries and all the components associated. It covers launch and recovery systems which are used to launch and recover the drones. It covers the inertial magnetic unit, the inertial navigation system, the flight control system, the ground control station and all associated components which are required to operate drones. It includes communication systems, the radio frequency, transponders, satellite based systems. It includes cameras, sensors, spraying systems and related payloads, and also safety systems like detect and avoid system or emergency recovery system or trackers, and finally all components which are critical for the safety and security of drones. So, anyone working on all these areas, including the software to make these things work, they are all covered under this particular drone PLI scheme. So, let us look at the current scenario of this particular scheme. So, 30 crores were dispersed in the year 22-23, okay, and there were 23 PLI beneficiaries, which was the list was released in July 2022. Out of these 23, 12 were drone manufacturers and 11 were drone component manufacturers. Okay. Correct. So, the scheme is picking up, and as I said, time will tell how successful this scheme would be. Moving ahead, another interesting scheme is the Krishi Udan scheme. The aim of this scheme is to assist farmers in transporting agricultural products. This scheme was launched by Government of India in 2020. And as I mentioned, to assist farmers in transporting the agricultural products, but interestingly both on national and as well as international routes. Okay. There are certain very specific aims of the Krishi Udan scheme. It covers the entire air transportation sector and the associated logistics for all agri produce. It ensures or aims to ensure seamless, cost effective and time bound air transportation. After 1 year, the new version of the scheme called as Krishi Udan 2.0 was announced, okay. And in this, based on the learnings of 1 year and the feedback from the industry, some provisions were enhanced, okay. And the focus of the Krishi Udan 2.0 is on transporting perishable food products. Okay. And the areas which are of prominence or importance for the Krishi Udan 2 are the hilly areas like Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand and northeastern states, and also the tribal areas, because there is a lot of tribal produce also which goes unattended or wasted. So, what are the objectives of the Krishi Udan scheme? Facilitating and incentivizing movement of agri produce by air transportation, this already we have seen, and this is done by waiver of many charges which constitute a large fraction of the operating cost, such as the landing charges, the parking charges, the terminal navigation and landing charges and the route navigation facilities. All these are waived if you are operating under the Krishi Udan scheme any flight that transports agricultural produce. It is meant for Indian freighters, for passengers to cargo operators also, and another aim of the objective of the scheme was to strengthen the cargo related infrastructure at airports and off the airports, because perishable cargo will not survive unless there is a proper supply chain available, and in many cases we need a refrigerated supply chain. Okay. So, then also some concessions were sought from other bodies, okay. Plus there was an attempt to go for resource pooling through establishing the convergence mechanism, and one of this mechanism we will talk about in the next slide is the e-Kaushal. So, facilitating the development of a hub and spoke model and freight grid, so that this whole system then becomes self-sustaining and functional. And as I mentioned, e-Kaushal is another initiative which is a part of the Krishi Udan scheme. E-Kaushal stands for Krishi Udan for Sustainable Holistic Agri-Logistics. This is basically a e-platform to facilitate information dissemination to all stakeholders. It is important that the people who are having perishable agricultural produce know where the demand is, and then they can decide on which market they should offload their products. Okay. So, it provides relevant information and it assists in coordination, monitoring and evaluation of the scheme also. Plus there is a proposal to integrate this with the National Agricultural Market, or ENAM as it is called. Once that happens, the whole system will become seamless for agricultural produce dispersal over the country. So, let us look at one major change between Krishi Udan original and 2.0. In Krishi Udan original, the waiver of airport charges to air cargo operators was provided only if at least half the freight was agricultural. Okay. But in Krishi Udan 2, it has been waived. You can request for waiver of airport charges even if the cargo is less than 50% of the total chargeable weight carried. So, this is a further incentive to encourage transportation of agricultural produce. Let us have a look at the implementation plan for the Krishi Udan 2.0. Interestingly, this particular scheme involves coordination between 8 ministries and departments of Government of India, and the aims of this scheme are to be distributed toward farmers, freight forwarders and airlines. Okay. Now, according to the Press Information Bureau note, already compared to the financial year before the scheme was launched 2021, in the financial year 21-22, there is an increase of 29% in the perishable cargo transported both on international and domestic routes. Now, this number is only up to 28th of February 2022. So, one more month's data has to be added, and that would probably increase the number slightly, but this is quite a substantial number anyway in 1 year. Okay. So, instead of 84,000 metric tons, 1,08,500 metric tons were transported. For phase 1 of Krishi Udan, 53 airports have been selected. Of these 53 airports, 25 are from the hilly areas, the northeastern states and the tribal regions, the regions where we would like to focus, and remaining 28 far from the rest of the country. Okay. And these numbers are going to be increased. More and more airports are going to be added to the Krishi Udan scheme as the scheme progresses. As I mentioned, the information has come from the Press Information Bureau press release. So, let us look at the focus routes and the products. So, you can see that different types of agricultural produce, either organic or seafood or fruits like lychees, pineapple, oranges, mandarin, or pulses, fruits and vegetables, or exotic vegetables like baby corn. These are the routes in which this particular scheme is implemented. So, what are the benefits of this particular scheme? First of all, it will lead to the growth of the agricultural sector, because a large part of our agricultural produce unfortunately is wasted and not really consumed. Okay. Then it will reduce the food wastage also, and also it will lead to an increase in the income of the farmers. So, these are the benefits of the Krishi Udaan scheme. Finally, let us look at another initiative. As I mentioned, this is not directly related to air transportation as such, but it is related to the aerospace ecosystem within the country, and that is the National Air Sports Policy NASP 2022. The source of this information has come from the website of the Civil Aviation Government. This particular scheme was launched on 7th of June 2022 by the Ministry of Civil Aviation. Okay. The vision of this scheme is to make India as one of the top sports nations by 2030, and the mission is to provide safe and affordable, accessible, enjoyable and sustainable air sports ecosystem. So, we have a growing culture for adventure sports and in aviation, and the benefits of this particular scheme in the long term are going to be growth in travel, tourism, infrastructure and local employment. The objectives of this scheme are to promote air sports culture in the country and to enable adoption of the international standards and practices, especially in the area of sports safety, infrastructure development and operation of the air sports. Okay. So, this will enhance the participation and success of Indian sportsperson in global air sport events, and it will also help in developing a simple, stakeholder friendly and effective governance structure. And finally, there is also a plan to bring in, just like a drone PLI scheme, another PLI scheme here to promote design, development and manufacturing of air sport equipment within the country. So, these are the long term objectives of this particular scheme. What does it cover? It covers all kinds of aero sports that you can think of, starting from aerobatics, aero modeling and model rocketry, which is becoming very popular in institutions all over the country. Then amateur built and experimental aircraft, it is intending to encourage this kind of a development in the country, ballooning, then drones, gliding and powered flight, hang gliding and powered hang gliding. These are all interesting aero sports which are gaining. Then parachuting, including skydiving, including jumping from buildings, antenna, bridge spans and earth cliffs, and also wingsuits, plus paragliding and paramotoring, including powered parachutes like trikes, powered aircraft including microlight, ultralight and light sport aircraft, and also finally it covers rotorcraft including the autogyro. So, as you can see, the complete landscape of aerosports in the country is covered in the NASP 2022 policy. They have set up a governing structure. So, there will be a central body called as the Air Sports Federation of India. This central body is going to monitor the work of individual air sport bodies such as the paragliding club or the hang gliding club or the aero modeling club. Under them there will be regional, state or UT bodies of these individual sports clubs, and within the regional bodies there will be district level bodies. So, they have gone for a governance structure. So, that is all about the NASP 2022. Apart from these 4 initiatives which the Government of India has taken, it is important for us to also note where we stand in India as compared to some of our neighbours in the South Asian region. Let us now have a look at where we in India stand in comparison with a few South Asian countries as far as the contribution of air transportation in our economic development is concerned. Particular study we look at Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Malaysia, Singapore and Bangladesh. The source of this data is the IATA reports in 2019, which have tabulated this information very nicely, and we have borrowed the information from there. Let us first look at the contribution to the economy in terms of jobs. So, we notice here that the largest number of jobs are in India. 404,000 direct jobs have been created by air transportation, followed by Singapore, Indonesia and Malaysia. Okay. So, the total number of jobs in millions is 6.2 millions in India, which is by far the largest value. The next is Indonesia, and then you have the other countries. If you look at the contribution to the GDP in terms of US dollars in billions, if you look at air transportation, we notice that the largest contribution to GDP is in Singapore, although it is a very small one city nation, but still 11.8% of the GDP of Singapore has come from air transportation, and the next would be Sri Lanka, which is about 9%, and then we have Nepal and Malaysia, and finally we have Indonesia. In India it is only 1.5%. Okay. But if you look at the numbers, you will realize that there is a huge contribution by air transportation to the economy, especially if you look at the numbers for exports. Once again, Singapore has the highest value of exports, and the next is only India. If we look at the passenger flows through the region if we look at passenger flows through air transportation by region, we notice that the largest amount of origin destination passenger flows from India is towards the Asia Pacific, okay, largest number, and the next is Indonesia, right. But then if we look at towards the Middle East, we find that the numbers are still quite large. Interestingly, in Pakistan, you have more people travelling to Middle East from Pakistan compared to Asia Pacific. And then the next thing is Europe, the next region where people travel is Europe. After that it is North America, after that it is South America, very few passengers, and also Africa. So, this is the data regarding the number of annual passenger flows through air transportation. Thank you so much for your attention.